A quiet town in Mississippi, a place where life moves at its own steady pace, was shaken to its core one summer morning. Among the usual hum of everyday life, a sound broke through, a faint, desperate cry coming from a place no one expected. Inside a cold metal dumpster, tucked beneath discarded trash, lay a newborn baby, barely alive. How could this happen? Who would abandon a child so helpless, so fragile, and leave them to an unthinkable fate? As the truth began to unravel, the town's shock turned to outrage, and outrage to haunting questions. The mother, a young woman named Julia, seemed like anyone you'd pass on the street, a quiet, kind soul with a life that, on the surface, appeared unremarkable. But just 24 hours after giving birth, Julia made a decision that would forever change her life and leave an entire community grappling with the unanswerable. Why? What led her to such a moment of despair? Was it fear, anger, or something far more complex? This is the story of Julia, a woman whose path to tragedy began in ways no one could have foreseen, a story of pain, of choices, and of a baby who miraculously survived against all odds. Welcome to True Crime Files, the channel where we delve into the most gripping stories of crime, survival, and justice. Here, we uncover the hidden truths behind the headlines and explore the events that changed lives forever. If you're passionate about uncovering the truth and exploring the human stories behind these tragedies, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. Stay with us as we unravel the harrowing chain of events that led to this unimaginable act, a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Julia was 23 years old. To anyone who knew her, she was described as kind-hearted, soft-spoken, and thoughtful. She wasn't the type to seek attention or make waves. Instead, she preferred the quiet rhythms of her life, keeping mostly to herself and finding comfort in the small, familiar town she called home. She lived with her mother, Pat, a strong and hard-working woman who had raised her two daughters alone after the death of her husband. Pat was the backbone of the family, holding everything together despite the challenges life had thrown her way. Julia's younger sister, Susan, was just 16, a lively teenager who adored her older sister, but often struggled to understand Julia's quiet, reserved nature. The family's home was modest, tucked away on a quiet street in a town where everyone seemed to know each other. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved as they passed by and where church on Sundays was a community ritual. For Julia, it was a haven, a space where she could find solace from the world outside. But despite the peaceful facade of her life, there were cracks beneath the surface. Julia carried the weight of her father's death, a loss that had left an indelible mark on her family. She was just a teenager when he passed, and though she rarely spoke about it, his absence was something she felt deeply. It shaped the way she viewed the world. Cautious, guarded, and always a little hesitant to let people in. She had a small circle of friends, but even among them, Julia was the one who listened more than she spoke. She wasn't one to share her problems, even when she was struggling. Those who knew her might have described her as shy, but there was something more to it. An invisible wall she had built, a way to protect herself from the unpredictability of life. Julia's days were simple. She worked part-time at a local diner where she was known for her warm smile and quiet efficiency. She spent her free time reading, helping her mother around the house, and looking after Susan when needed. She didn't date much and seemed content with her routine. But there were moments when Julia would retreat into herself, her thoughts heavy with worries she didn't know how to express. Pat noticed it, of course. As a mother, she could sense when something was bothering her daughter, but Julia would always brush it off with a soft smile and a quick reassurance that she was fine. To the outside world, Julia's life seemed uneventful, even peaceful. But as we know, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the surface, Julia was struggling with emotions she couldn't quite put into words. Feelings of loss, loneliness, and a growing sense of uncertainty about her future. What no one could have known at the time was how vulnerable she was. Vulnerable to the unexpected. Vulnerable to the wrong people. Vulnerable to a series of events that would change everything. Julia's story reminds us that even those who seem to have quiet, ordinary lives can carry burdens we may never see. And sometimes it's in those moments of quiet struggle that the foundations begin to shift, leading to choices and actions that leave us asking, how did it come to this? As you think about Julia's life before everything changed, consider this. What might drive someone like her, a kind, caring, and introverted young woman, to make a decision that shocks an entire community? What could have pushed her to the edge? And was there anything that could have stopped it? Julia's life began to change the day she met Nick. He was new in town, a biker who immediately caught everyone's attention. His loud motorcycle, his rugged appearance, and his confident demeanor made him stand out in the quiet community. Nick was the kind of man who seemed larger than life. Someone who could light up a room with his charm, but also carry an edge that made people take notice. For Julia, Nick was unlike anyone she had ever met. He was bold, adventurous, and magnetic in a way that drew her in. He would stop by the diner where she worked, always choosing a seat where she was serving. At first, he made small talk, complimenting her smile, asking about her day, and cracking jokes that made her laugh despite herself. He had a way of making her feel special, seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Over the weeks, Nick began to show more interest in Julia. He would bring her small gifts, a flower, a piece of candy, a charm bracelet he said reminded him of her. She was hesitant at first, unsure of his intentions, but Nick had a way of breaking down her walls. He listened when she spoke, remembered the little details she shared, and always seemed genuinely interested in her life. For someone as reserved as Julia, his attention was intoxicating. She wasn't used to being the center of someone's world, and Nick made her feel like she was. He had a way of making her forget her worries, even if just for a little while. But what Julia didn't know was that Nick's interest in her wasn't as innocent as it seemed. While he played the role of the charming admirer, he was quietly weaving a plan, one that would shatter the trust she had begun to place in him. After weeks of building their connection, Nick invited Julia to his apartment. He framed it as something casual, a chance to get to know each other better, away from the prying eyes of the small town. Julia was nervous but flattered. She had started to trust Nick, believing that he saw her for who she really was. The night at Nick's apartment started off harmless enough. He offered her a drink, played music, and made her laugh with stories about his travels. But as the evening went on, Julia began to feel uneasy. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something didn't feel right. Then, without warning, everything changed. Julia's memories of what happened next would remain fragmented, a blur of confusion, fear, and helplessness. Nick had drugged her drink. She didn't realize it until it was too late, her body becoming sluggish and unresponsive as the world around her began to spin. What followed was a nightmare. Nick wasn't alone that night. 2 of his friends were there, waiting. Julia was powerless to stop what happened. The betrayal, the violation, the complete loss of control, it was something she never imagined she would experience. When she woke the next morning, the weight of what had happened crushed her. Nick was gone, and she was left alone in the apartment, her mind racing with questions and fears. How could this have happened? How could she have trusted him? And what would she do now? Julia didn't tell anyone about the assault. She couldn't bring herself to say the words out loud. The shame and fear were overwhelming, and she convinced herself that no one would believe her. After all, Nick was well liked in town, and she had willingly gone to his apartment. In the days and weeks that followed, Julia withdrew even further into herself. She went through the motions of her daily life, but the light that once shone in her had dimmed. She carried the weight of what had happened in silence, her pain invisible to those around her. But the story didn't end there. A few weeks later, Julia discovered she was pregnant. The realization was like a punch to the gut, a reminder of everything she had tried so hard to push down. She felt trapped, cornered by a reality she couldn't escape. In Mississippi, where Julia lived, abortion was illegal. Even if she had wanted to terminate the pregnancy, it wasn't an option. The laws left her with no choice but to carry the child, a constant, growing reminder of the night that had stolen so much from her. As the months passed, Julia's emotions became more complex. She felt anger, sadness, and resentment at Nick, at herself, and at the life growing inside her. She didn't know how to reconcile the love and care she had always associated with motherhood with the circumstances of this pregnancy. For 9 months, Julia carried the weight of her trauma alone. She never told her family what had happened, never sought help, and never let anyone in. She was completely isolated in her pain, convinced that no one could understand. Her story raises a difficult but important question. How should society support victims like Julia? Victims who are left to navigate their trauma alone, with no safety net, no resources, and no way to escape the shadows of their past? It's a question that deserves our attention, because for too many women, Julia's story isn't unique. Julia's world shifted once again when she discovered she was pregnant. It was a quiet morning, the kind she would have usually spent lost in her thoughts, but this time her mind refused to settle. The signs had been there, the missed periods, the fatigue, the changes in her body, but she had pushed them aside, unwilling to confront what they meant. The confirmation came with a single test, the result staring back at her like an accusation. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a tidal wave, dragging her into an ocean of fear and despair. The pregnancy was a cruel reminder of the night she had tried so hard to forget. It wasn't just the physical burden, it was the emotional weight of carrying a life conceived in violence. For Julia, the child growing inside her wasn't a symbol of hope or new beginnings. It was a constant, unrelenting reminder of the pain and betrayal she had endured. In Mississippi, where Julia lived, abortion was not an option. The laws were strict, leaving no room for exceptions in cases like hers. Even if she had wanted to end the pregnancy, the legal system had already decided her fate. The state's stance on abortion left countless women like Julia with no agency, no control over their own bodies, and no escape from the circumstances forced upon them. As the days turned into weeks, Julia's emotions became a storm she couldn't contain. Anger burned within her, directed at everyone and everything: the man who had violated her, the laws that had trapped her, and even the unborn child she carried. To Julia, the baby wasn't an innocent life waiting to be welcomed into the world. It was a symbol of everything she had lost: her autonomy, her safety, and the small sense of peace she had once known. She felt trapped, suffocated by the life growing inside her and the choices that had been stolen from her. Each kick, each flutter, each reminder of the child's presence filled her with a mix of rage and sorrow that she couldn't escape. She hated the way her body had become a vessel for a memory she couldn't erase. Julia withdrew even further from the people around her. She avoided her mother's concerned glances and her sister's attempts to cheer her up. She didn't know how to explain the storm inside her without revealing the truth of what had happened. And so, she kept it all inside, the weight of her silence pressing down on her more with each passing day. The isolation was unbearable. Julia felt like she was living in a world where no one could hear her, where her pain was invisible and her voice didn't matter. The nights were the worst, filled with thoughts she couldn't quiet and emotions she couldn't control. She would sit in the dark, her hands resting on her growing belly, and feel nothing but bitterness and resentment. The months dragged on, and Julia became a shadow of the person she had once been. The vibrant, kind young woman her friends and family knew was gone, replaced by someone who barely recognized herself. She had no plan, no hope, and no idea how she would face the future. As the pregnancy neared its end, Julia's emotions reached a breaking point. She couldn't see a way out, couldn't imagine a future where she could move past what had happened. The idea of bringing the child into the world filled her with dread. She didn't know how she could ever look at the baby without being reminded of the pain that had brought it into existence. For Julia, the months of carrying the pregnancy were a slow descent into despair. The weight of her trauma, compounded by the lack of choices available to her, left her feeling hopeless and alone. It's a reality that many women in similar situations face, left to navigate unimaginable pain with no support, no options, and no way to take back control of their lives. As we think about Julia's story, it's important to ask, do stricter laws contribute to tragedies like this? When women are left with no choices, no resources, and no support, what kind of outcomes should we expect? These are questions that demand reflection and action because stories like Julia's are not as uncommon as we might hope. The final chapter of Julia's harrowing journey began in the solitude of her bedroom. The labor came in waves, sudden and overwhelming, and there was no one there to help her. She hadn't prepared for this moment, hadn't sought out a hospital or a midwife. Whether out of shame, fear, or a desperate attempt to keep everything hidden, Julia chose to face this alone. The hours dragged on, each contraction a stark reminder of what was about to happen. The pain was physical, yes, but it was also deeply emotional, cutting into her soul in ways she couldn't articulate. She tried to focus on her breathing, tried to silence the thoughts that flooded her mind, but they wouldn't stop. When the baby was born, the room was eerily quiet. No cries, no celebration, just the sound of Julia's ragged breathing and the distant hum of life continuing outside her window. For a moment, she looked at the baby, small and fragile, lying on the makeshift bed she had prepared. The tiny hands, the closed eyes, the soft wisp of hair. Everything about the child was innocent. And yet to Julia the sight was almost unbearable. Her emotions were a whirlwind. There was sadness, a deep and aching sadness for what had been taken from her, and for the life that had just entered the world under such circumstances. There was guilt gnawing at the edges of her consciousness, whispering that she should feel differently, that she should love this child despite everything. But there was also a numbness, a detachment that had settled over her in the months leading up to this moment. In the hours that followed, Julia struggled with a decision she had made long before. She had told herself this was the only way, that she couldn't raise this child, that she couldn't face the questions and the judgment. She had convinced herself that this was the only option left to her. As night fell, Julia wrapped the baby in an old blanket. Her hands trembled, her breath came in shallow gasps, but her face was a mask of resolve. She avoided looking at the child, avoided letting her mind wander to thoughts of what could have been. Instead, she focused on what she believed needed to be done. In the darkness, Julia walked through the quiet streets, the baby cradled in her arms. Her heart raced with every step, her mind a blur of fear and determination. She avoided the main roads, sticking to alleys and side streets, hoping no one would see her. She reached the dumpster, an unremarkable metal container, tucked away behind a row of buildings. For a moment, she stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could hear her own heartbeat, feel the chill of the night air against her skin. Then, with a final, trembling breath, she placed the baby inside. She did not look back. She couldn't. Her feet carried her away, faster and faster, until she was running through the streets, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in her ears. When she reached the safety of her home, Julia collapsed onto her bed. Her body was exhausted, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. She felt relief, fleeting and hollow. She felt sadness, so heavy it was hard to breathe. And she felt guilt, a guilt so profound that it threatened to consume her. In the hours that followed, Julia lay in the dark, tears streaming down her face. She told herself she had done what she had to do, that there was no other way. But the truth was, she didn't know if she believed that. The reality of what she had done was too much to face, too much to fully comprehend. For Julia, the act of abandoning her baby was the culmination of months of pain, fear, and hopelessness. It was a decision born not of malice, but of desperation, a desperate attempt to escape a reality she felt powerless to change. And yet it was a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It was the early hours of the morning when a faint, high-pitched sound broke the stillness of a quiet Mississippi alley. A passerby, taking a shortcut on their way home, stopped in their tracks. The sound, soft and almost imperceptible at first, grew clearer as they approached a row of dumpsters. It was unmistakable, a baby's cry. The individual hesitated, unsure if what they were hearing was real. But as they drew closer, the cries became louder, more insistent. With trembling hands, they opened the lid of one of the dumpsters. There, amidst the discarded garbage and refuse, was a tiny, swaddled figure. A baby. The shock was immediate, the horror undeniable. The passerby acted quickly, scooping up the child and rushing to call emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes, taking the infant, cold but alive, into their care. The baby's cries continued as they placed her in the ambulance, a fragile but undeniable testament to her will to survive. At the hospital, doctors worked swiftly to ensure the baby's health. She was malnourished, her body chilled from the hours spent outside, but remarkably she had survived. The medical team's relief was palpable as they confirmed she would recover. For the baby, this was a second chance at life. News of the discovery spread quickly, shaking the small town to its core. Authorities launched an immediate investigation, piecing together the events that had led to such a heartbreaking act. The blanket wrapped around the child, the location of the dumpster, and local witnesses all provided clues that eventually pointed back to Julia. When the police arrived at Julia's home, she was unprepared. The weight of her actions had already begun to take its toll, but now the reality of the consequences was unavoidable. Julia was taken into custody, her face a mix of resignation and sorrow. The media caught wind of the story, and soon Julia's name and face were everywhere. Headlines painted her as a monster, a cold-hearted mother who had abandoned her child. The public outrage was immediate and intense. People demanded justice for the baby, called for harsher penalties, and questioned how something like this could happen in their community. Yet, as the story unfolded, another narrative began to emerge. Details of Julia's assault, her pregnancy, and her emotional struggles came to light. Advocates for victims of sexual violence stepped forward, arguing that Julia was as much a victim as the child she had abandoned. They highlighted the lack of support systems for women in her situation and called for a deeper examination of the societal and legal structures that had left her with no viable options. Julia faced legal proceedings that further divided public opinion. On one hand, there were those who demanded she face the full force of the law, arguing that abandoning her baby was unforgivable. On the other, there were those who saw her as a tragic figure, someone who had been failed by the system and driven to an unthinkable act by circumstances beyond her control. The courtroom was filled with tension as Julia's defense team presented her story in full. They spoke of the trauma she had endured, the isolation she had felt, and the desperation that had led her to believe there was no other way. Prosecutors, however, painted a picture of recklessness and irresponsibility, emphasizing the danger she had placed her baby in. As the trial continued, the community's reaction remained divided. Some people used the case as a rallying cry for better victim support systems, demanding that resources be put in place to prevent tragedies like this in the future. Others struggled to reconcile Julia's actions with her circumstances, torn between anger and empathy. For the baby, now in the custody of child welfare services, her future remained uncertain. She had survived against all odds, but her story was forever intertwined with the tragedy of her beginnings. Her cries had saved her, drawing attention to a moment of unimaginable despair, but they also served as a reminder of the many questions that would remain unanswered. Julia's story, heartbreaking and complex, left a lasting mark on everyone who heard it. It was a story of pain and resilience, of choices made in the shadow of trauma, and of a society grappling with its role in both her suffering and her actions. And as the town moved forward, it carried with it the weight of the lessons learned, the lives affected, and the hope that such a tragedy might never happen again. The story of Julia is one that leaves us with more questions than answers. What led her to make such a devastating decision? Was it the weight of her trauma, the isolation she felt, or the lack of support from those around her? Or was it all of these factors, combined in a way that overwhelmed her ability to see another path forward? Julia was not born a monster. She was a young woman navigating life in a small town, a daughter who had lost her father, a sister who cared deeply for her family. But somewhere along the way, her world began to unravel, piece by piece, until all that was left was the despair that consumed her. What she did cannot be excused, but it must be understood. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society handles trauma, mental health, and the fallout of violence. Was this an act of pure evil, or the culmination of systemic failures that allowed a victim of unimaginable suffering to fall through the cracks? The baby, now safe and cared for, serves as a reminder of the resilience of life, even in its most fragile form. But this story isn't just about survival. It's about the lessons we must learn to prevent such tragedies in the future. What could have been done to support Julia before her pain led to such a catastrophic act? How do we as a society create systems that offer hope and help, even in the darkest moments? This case also highlights the limitations of justice. Julia faced the full force of the law, but what about Nick and his accomplices? What about the structures that allowed her to remain silent for so long, that failed to give her the tools to heal? Justice is not only about punishment, it's about ensuring that the circumstances leading to such acts are addressed, and that no one else is forced into the same impossible corner. As we close this chapter, we are left with the weight of reflection. This isn't just Julia's story. It is the story of countless others who suffer in silence, their pain invisible to the world, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Next time on True Crime Files, we will delve into another case, one that reveals yet again how society's failures can lead to devastating consequences. If this story moved you, if it made you think or question, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these stories to light. and to foster discussions about how we can do better as a society. Thank you for watching, and remember, every story has layers, and every tragedy is an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to strive for a world where such pain is lessened, one person at a time.